Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, already the initials JBE are becoming a part of the local language as the governor-elect prepares to take over. For another well-used set of initials, BP, the time and the spotlight may be closing as pending cases wind down. We'll be discussing these stories tonight, as well as, FYI, Mayor Landrieu's future, shootings and terrorism, coaches coming and going, and our Future Watch segment examines safety improvements on the causeway. Joining us, PDQ, are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Kevin McGill, political reporter, The Associated Press. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go over to Errol now, who gave me all of those initials to read in that opening script. But to an issue that certainly is a very sad and tragic one, it's shootings happening way too often. We've seen them here, mass shootings, and of course the one most recently in California. It's just something that boggles the mind.
Unfortunately, it's to the point now where every state can pretty much talk about their own shootings. As we were doing before the show, we were trying to think, well, let's count our local shootings and which ones would you call terrorism and which one would you not. Ultimately, it doesn't make any difference, but I guess in terms of the analysis, it's important. In terms of the classical definition, we know that things in San Bernardino today, the FBI did declare as being terrorists. Now, I'll let Kevin give the definition of that. But the incidents that we've had in Louisiana, the Bunny Fred shooting was more of a gang shooting. And we've seen this sort of thing whenever there's a event with a lot of people and people are excited and you got these kids and they got guns and they start shooting. The tragedy in Lafayette, it could be debated, but it seemed to be more of a mental illness type of shooting. There was the shooting of the deputies in St. John's Parish, and that seemed to be something that could be terrorist in the sense that there may have been a political motivation, or maybe not, but it was more of like a right-wing sort of thing, and so it was a little bit different.
In St. John, it was the accused in the shootings and there were several police officers wounded and 2 who died, as I recall. The accused shooters have been linked to right-wing causes and anti-government organizations. The Lafayette Theater shooting, the man who killed himself, the suspect who killed himself, and so of course we'll never know his real motivations. There were allusions to some right-wing causes on some of his social media and his computer records. Ultimately, in San Bernardino, just today, the FBI did declare that a terrorism investigation. On social media and shows like radio talk shows, you'll always hear the back and forth over whether something should be called terrorism or not. The FBI, from what I've been reading, has a very specific set of definitions as to whether something fits into terrorism, one of them being, and probably the most important, an effort to affect policy, either government or social policy. At any rate, the people who were involved or the people who were victimized or who are nearby are certainly terrorized, no matter what the government definition is.
And a common denominator for all of them, whether it's called terrorism or not, is the availability of guns. Mm-hmm. And there's always this debate that comes up after the incident. And I think it's noteworthy that we have just finished a gubernatorial election that's stretched maybe over 2 years. And not once did guns really become a main issue in this. And I think it's because the candidates all gravitate towards the same place because they know that this is a state that doesn't really,
Sportsman's paradise.
Yeah, that doesn't want to talk about any kind of serious gun regulation. And so it never even got to the point where it became an issue. And so there were things like Obama bashing and those sort of things became issues, but not guns. But curiously, I think the one time that guns was mentioned was the night of the tragedy in Lafayette when Governor Jindal went there, and the press asked him about guns, and he says, well, tonight our thoughts and prayers are with the family.
Yeah, he refused to discuss it.
He says, we'll talk about politics tomorrow. So to him, he dismissed guns. Whether you're for or against it, it's more than politics. Mm-hmm. I mean, he dismissed as part of the political discussion.
Yeah, there still doesn't seem to be any change in the political stance that either side on the gun control issue is going to take. The Senate, I believe, had some type of gun control. The U.S. Senate had some type of gun control vote just the other day, and it fell along the usual lines. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the presidential race, and whether anyone will try and make it an issue, or see if the pendulum swings either way.
Of course, a mental health issue also comes into play with this, too. There's been a lot of talk about that, and there was one other incident just right after Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving, in Colorado. So we're hearing of this way too often on a national scale, and then we see it on the home front, too, with the shootings that we've had here, Bunny Friend recently, and then, of course, there was a Mother's Day shooting, there's Bourbon Street shooting. So,
and when you have these incidents, on the one hand, it could make people think, yeah, we need tougher gun regulations. On the other hand, there are probably some people's attitudes are hardened, saying this is proof why we need guns, because they have these people out there who have guns. Well, and so I don't know if all this is doing anything to move the debate one way or the other.
It's baffling, it's frightening, it's very worrisome, and hopefully we can do something to improve the situation, and soon. Okay, we're going to go over now to Kevin, and we're talking about transition. John Bel Edwards is governor-elect. Campaign over. He's in the transition mode now.
He is. He's raising the private funds for the transition and inauguration. And meanwhile, John Bel Edwards is taking steps to make sure that conservatives aren't frightened by at the prospect of him being a very far left governor. He's also making clear he is going to be a Democratic governor. He gave a speech to the Council for a Better Louisiana this week, where he made that point. I'm going to govern from the center, but he also noted several things that he is going to support as governors, things he campaigned on: a minimum wage increase, equal pay for women, expansion of Medicaid under the Federal Affordable Care Act. Ultimately, where he sits as governor and how his administration, whether his administration is successful, is going to be his relationship with the legislature. And one factor in that is going to be who is going to be Speaker of the House. As long as I think any of us can remember, the governor, although we have equal and supposedly separate branches of government, the governor has always been able to say, I would like for this person to be the Speaker of the House, and the House falls in line and elects that person Speaker. We've had instances where governors have crossed party lines. Dave Treen, who was the first Republican governor since Reconstruction, had a Democratic speaker, and then a Democrat, John Hankel, who later became a Republican. Mike Foster had Hunt Downer, who was a Democrat at the time, and later Charlie DeWitt, who was a lifelong Democrat. This is the first time, though, that we'll have a Democratic governor, I believe, and a majority Republican House. And, of course, we've got Walt Leger from the New Orleans area, who's a Democrat, who has the support of John Bel Edwards. We also have Cameron Henry from this area, a Republican, who is making the pitch for the Republicans to vote as a bloc and make him Speaker, while both sides say, which often happens, that they have the votes lined up to become the next Speaker, which means somebody has been misinformed or is not telling the truth. And we may not know, and this is big, historic, we may not know until January 11th who the next Speaker of the House is going to be.
So we're heading toward a contest then.
And it's looking like a real contest, and it will be a real test of the strength and solidarity of the Republican House delegation. It'll be a test of how strong the traditionally very strong Louisiana governor is. And it'll be a test of John Bel Edwards' influence with the legislature.
When the governor says that he's going to issue an executive order opening opportunities for gays in the administration, what does that change? What's different? What's the situation right now?
It's an executive order that he hasn't actually issued it yet, and the details of it we don't know yet. But it sounds like a throwback to what Kathleen Blanco had issued, just basically banning discrimination by state agencies and state contractors on the basis of sexual orientation. Bobby Jindal chose not to do it. I believe Edwin Edwards had done the same thing. Mike Foster had not, and Bobby Jindal refused. So
So it's broken along party lines.
It did move along party lines in that case, and it may have been a bit of a surprise, but not a total surprise, because both Kathleen Blanco and John Bel Edwards are, again, trying to strike a centrist position, and once upon a time that might have seemed like a very liberal thing to do. In fact, these days it's probably not.
Well, the governor-elect has a lot of hiring decisions to make in just a few weeks, really, not much time.
Yeah, he's going to. It's more a matter of appointments to great. I don't even know the number anymore. Boards and commissions, some of which will need Senate approval, and that's one source of the governor's. That's one reason why John Bel Edwards. There are a couple of reasons why he may still have a lot more power than it might initially seem as a Democrat in a red state facing a Republican majority House and Senate. Governors are powerful in Louisiana both through Constitution and statute, the number of appointments they get to make to curry favor, patronage, also just by tradition. But those appointments to the various boards and commissions, that's a chance to grant patronage, and that might come into play in ways we won't actually see in who becomes speaker and how much sway he has with the legislature.
Cabinet decisions before him as well. Will those be made, do you think, before inauguration?
Yeah, he'll be naming his cabinet in the next few weeks with an eye towards, and the Senate will have to confirm them. Interesting appointments that he announced this week were to a transition committee to look at the fiscal mess that is left to the next legislature and the new governor. One of the heads of that is Foster Campbell, the Public Service Commissioner, who has run for various public offices, statewide public offices, and who has been a champion for many, many years of an oil processing tax. Now, that did not come up in the announcement of his appointment, and it seems unlikely at a time when oil prices are so low and when the oil industry is laying people off that will come up again. But it's interesting. It'll be interesting because oil prices will come back up again, and it'll be interesting to see how much influence Foster Campbell will have in the administration, and if the administration might actually push for that at some point.
Okay, a lot of business to be taken care of in these weeks ahead. Thanks a lot, Kevin. All right, over to Richard right now. BP, and there was some development now in court cases this week.
Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen some of the major remaining criminal cases tied to the BP oil spill resolved. And so what we saw this week was three years ago, the Attorney General, Eric Holder, had come to New Orleans, and he sat on the courtroom steps, and he said that the government was going to hold BP accountable for the spill, and they announced the indictments of 3 BP workers at that point. 2 of them, one was Donald Vadrine and Robert Kaluza, were the well site leaders on board the rig. And of the 4 BP workers who were charged, they faced the most serious charges of them. Initially, they were charged with 11 counts of seaman's manslaughter.
Because 11 men died.
Because 11 men died in the accident, as well as 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter and 1 count of violating the Clean Water Act apiece. And so over time, over the last 3 years, like some of the other workers who were charged in the wake of the spill, they were charged with more serious counts that eventually were reduced for what they eventually faced. And so what happened this week, bringing this back up to it, was the 11 seaman's manslaughter counts had since been, a judge had moved to dismiss those counts, and so they still face the involuntary manslaughter counts. And the government moved this past week to drop those.
Those were dropped.
Those were dropped.
And that was against Vadrine and Kaluza.
That was against Vadrine and Kaluza.
But there are other charges, misdemeanor charges.
And so at that point, they each faced a misdemeanor for violating the Clean Water Act, which carried a potential 1 year in jail with it. And so what we saw this week was that Vadrine had actually accepted a plea deal with the government. The judge has still not ruled on it yet, but the parameters that were discussed were about 10 months of probation, 100 hours of community service, and a $50,000 fine that would go to a wildlife fund.
And the other gentleman?
And the other gentleman, Bob Kaluza, has actually decided he's going to fight this Clean Water Act charge at trial in February.
So, bottom line, it would seem that there is not going to be any prison time served by anyone involved with this.
That's ultimately where they're at, is that of the 4, there were 5 workers who were charged. One was a Halliburton manager as well, but of the 4 BP workers, what this ultimately means is that it's very unlikely that any of them are going to see any jail time.
It's kind of it's got to be an embarrassment for the government, because they went after these 4 individuals, Kaluza, Vadrine, there was Kurt Mix, the former engineer, who was accused of effectively of obstructing an investigation into that notoriously low estimate of how much oil was flowing from the well. There was David Rainey, I believe his name was, who was acquitted by a jury. And in that case, it was kind of interesting. Judge Englehart, Kurt Englehart, who presided over that, went out of his way, it seemed, to tell the jury this was a correct verdict. The federal government just did not do well when it went after individuals in this case. And there was interestingly, there was a case in the North, I can't remember which state, where the major mine disaster happened, where I think 91 people were killed. And that was another case where all the government could get against an individual, an administrator, a manager for the mine company, a misdemeanor guilty verdict.
And in the case with David Rainey, too, that was another example where he'd been charged with more than he ultimately went to trial with. He was charged with obstruction of Congress as well as lying to investigators. Judge Englehart dropped the obstruction of Congress charge right before the trial with concerns that he wouldn't be able to present a fair defense at trial. And then he was ultimately acquitted of lying to investigators.
This is all separate from the fines that BP is paying.
And the government, there were the fines, there were the settlements of the civil suits, and the BP as a corporate entity, and Richard may know more about this, they pleaded guilty to some criminal acts and had to pay, I think ultimately that's part of the billions that they will pay. The BP isn't getting off scot-free, but attempts to hold individuals, the federal government just hasn't seemed to be able to make anything stick to
Criminally
any
liable
criminally
for this.
liable for individuals.
Why? Why was that so hard?
And that is something that the attorneys haven't been commenting on, but it certainly looks in these cases like maybe if there were individuals that should have been held responsible, they had the wrong ones. Again, I go back to the David Rainey trial when Judge Englehart looked at the jurors and was thanking them for their service and said, I think you had the correct verdict. The Kurt Mix trial, he was initially convicted, but there was jury misconduct, and ultimately he pleaded guilty to get it over with to a misdemeanor, but came out on the courthouse steps and declared himself exonerated.
And very disappointed in the justice system, criminal justice system.
All of these, days later, Kurt Mix had the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he said he'd been scapegoated, which is the same theme that you've seen with some of these other guys as well.
All right. Well, one more case before the courts, though.
But we'll see. It's scheduled in February, but
Okay.
if it comes to pass.
All right, Richard, thank you. Errol, over to you right now. Mayor Landrieu, Mitch Landrieu, has said he's made it clear he does not want to seek the U.S. Senate seat that Senator Vitter will be vacating.
Yeah, we need to acknowledge our friend Jeremy Alford because he broke the story that he'd interviewed the mayor and he edited it in his lawpolitics.com newsletter, and then the rest of the media were able to pick it up. But there had been speculation whether or not the mayor would run for Senate. And, he said he wants to finish out his term, and you can't blame him because I think there's a real excitement about the second term because this is the term that's going to cross over into the tricentennial. And a lot of his thinking, a lot of the things he's been talked about, and you can tell that he's excited about the city and things that are happening, and he wants to be there for that. I think he would have also had a tough time being elected to the Senate. I mean, you shouldn't read too much into John Bel Edwards' election. There were a lot of circumstances that fell into play. The biggest negative, even though there's probably few more qualified people politically or governmentally than Mitch Landrieu, is that he's from New Orleans and he's been the mayor of New Orleans, and that's always created some sort of bias in state politics, and there's still probably time for one more round of Obama bashing, as we've seen in two other campaigns, and so I think he could have been a victim of that. And so why did he need that when he can be mayor of New Orleans and finish out his term? He's had a fairly good year. I mean, on the negative, there's been crime, but I don't think anybody's making that his fault, even though people say, we need to have more police. But I think one big thing he did was finally a settlement with the firemen's situation. And then this past week, the councilman approved a budget, which as far as budgets go, was fairly upbeat, that there were some things that were funded, including police salaries. And so it wasn't as dire as past budgets are. Now, it did have a parking increase on the streets in the French Quarter. And so those two things were a good thing. One pure sign that I don't think he's interested in running statewide is you brought back the whole monuments issue,
right,
which is something that has played negatively statewide. And so the fact that they brought back that issue, I think, says he's ready for the fight, even though we don't know where it's going to go. But
Well, he says he has still a lot of work to do, and certainly there are a lot of things that need to be addressed in the city. And
I think he's
gonna stay here to do
excited
that.
about seeing him. He's in a position that it's like you got this plan of getting close to the tricentennial.
Right.
I want to be there for that.
And that's a big moment in the city.
Actually,
okay,
yeah.
Errol, thanks. Don, over to you for Future Watch. Causeway safety.
Causeway safety. Causeway was in the news a lot earlier this year with accidents. There was already a year-long study underway with some Texas experts on how to increase safety on the bridge. To back up for just a second, the bridge is actually quite safe even with those accidents. There have been 13 cars going over the bridge since 1994, and it's traveled at capacity every single day. It's got 6 times more cars on it than it did in 1994 when the second span opened. So in terms of sheer numbers, while every accident that happens is tragic, there aren't really that many horrific accidents happening on the bridge. Nevertheless, they're looking at increasing the size of the rails, especially on the southbound span, where the rails are only 25 inches tall. And the plan would have those rails go with 2 more steel rods across, all the way up to 46 inches. And on the northbound side, there would be 1 new steel rail, getting it from 31 inches up to 45 inches, which they feel would increase safety dramatically, especially with the higher profile vehicles of today. On Wednesday of next week, the Causeway Commission will meet and get the first numbers, the estimated numbers of what it would cost to put these safety mechanisms into place. The next big step would be where in the world that money's coming from. There's not a whole lot of federal money. The federal budget for that is somewhat limited. There's not much state money. There might be state loans at a very low interest rate. There also may be the ability to bond it out through increased tolls. Yeah. The tolls on the bridge have not increased since 1995 when they went from $1 to $3. So it's been 20 years since there's been an increase, but there are others who say, well, if only 13 cars have gone over since 1994, is it really worth spending the money? So that's the argument that will probably take place over the next year. In addition to the increased railings, they're also looking at a plan to put shoulders just 2 blocks long at each of the crossovers along the bridge. So it's an extra 672 feet where those crossovers are of bridge that would fly out. They say that would triple the emergency stopping area on the bridge. Major reduction in delays and also accidents, because as accidents or breakdowns happen on the bridge, they can lead to other accidents. Yes. A lot of rear-ending. Causeway Commission leader Carlton Dufershow told me every day there are at least 8 breakdowns on one span of the bridge, every single day. And as there's a breakdown and you've got one car, all it takes is one car not paying attention to be rear-ending that broken down vehicle. You told me you had your own experience on the bridge.
Yeah,
they
do
flat
have tire. You don't want to get a flat tire on the
Causeway police are very quick, and
the
MAP, the Motor Assistance Patrol, they say they are 2 every scene, usually within 5 minutes, but that 5 minutes can feel really long if you're in a broken down car with people traveling at 70 miles an hour around you.
And they have those phones posted along with about every half mile or so.
Right. They also have increased patrols, very much so in the last year, both with their own police force and help from the state police in helicopters above, and that seems to have contributed to the safety, but be looking next week for those numbers to come out, and it may be about $53 million to do the steel rails and another $60 million to do the shoulders, so,
it's going to be costly.
$113 million, and nobody's pockets seem to be that full.
One thing about the Causeway, you never get lost.
Exactly.
How do you get to Mandeville? Go straight.
You might get a little distracted. Not lost, but distracted.
I can only say when I had my flat tire incident, there was help there behind me almost immediately. It was pretty scary with a car full of people, including my mom at the time, and 2 little kids. It was really frightening, but they handled it really, really well. So we'll see.
We will see.
Okay. Coaches coming and going.
Yeah, over the last few weeks, we've had a flurry of coach firings, and because we were covering politics, we weren't able to deal with that. But this is the time of the year when coaches are fired, I guess. But they're kind of interesting stories. Rob Ryan with the Saints being fired. People saw it coming after the disaster with the Washington Redskins. And this guy, Dennis Allen, who had been with the Saints before, he'd been the head coach at Oakland, was sort of like waiting in the wings, has taken over. He seemed to have done okay with his first game last week, even though the Saints still lost. But we'll see if he's the future. The really interesting story was Les Miles, because after he lost those games with Ole Miss, Miss and Alabama, there was such a demand to fire Les Miles and so much passion about it. And then after the game, when they beat Texas A&M last week, quickly they announced that he'd be back next week. And then this past week, the president of LSU, Alexander King, was talking to a group, and he pointed out, a lot of people said that Les Miles had in his contract a $15 million buyout, and LSU really didn't want to be going to the legislature at appropriation time. At the same time, they're paying a coach a $15 million buyout. Now, that's two separate funds. That LSU's got the Tiger Athletic Foundation, and they got rich alumni who put up money. But still, the fact is, you're paying a coach $15 million to leave, at the same time that you're trying to get some more money. They just didn't think that it played too well politically. And the fact is, some people say, the LSU looks good for next year, that they got some younger players who are coming back, and some of the teams like Ole Miss and Alabama are losing some players. And so next year could be a good year for LSU anyway, and saving $15 million is nice. And by the way, also part of the deal is that in addition to the $15 million, there'd been another $2 million that would have gone to Les Miles' coaching staff. So there'd been $17 million to get rid of this coaching staff. Curtis Johnson at Tulane was let go last week. The poor guy, I never got to meet him, but he seemed like the nicest guy in the world. I mean, he seemed like somebody you want to have lunch with and just talk and tell stories. But Tulane has upped its competition. It's having a tough time. The inherent problem that Tulane football has, though, is that whenever it gets a successful coach, they don't stay. Because if you can do well at Tulane, then the other schools say, well, this guy must be good. Let's bring him on. So it's happened over time.
Let me jump in here now because we're just about out of time. Tulane now has a new athletic director as well.
Right,
Okay.
and that's what they've done. They've hired a new athletic director, guy out of Northern Iowa University. Right. And the first thing they told him is that you have to find a new coach. Okay,
the first thing I'm going to tell you is we're looking ahead now.
Okay, well, actually, you can look today that Forbes magazine on their website did a story about John Bell Edwards, and the headline is Louisiana is heading towards trouble. And then they talked about the problems that at least Forbes sees with having a Democratic governor with a Republican legislature.
We shall see.
Along those lines, we'll start perhaps in the next week, certainly in the next few weeks, hearing some more details about what he hopes to accomplish in order to shrink that potential $1 billion budget hole he'll have next year, including getting rid of some of the tax credits and exemptions, and perhaps a readjustment to the better of tax rates.
Don.
I'll look to provide a little more cheer on this table today. The crew of Kringle Parade rolls downtown tomorrow, starting at the Lee Circle area at 1 o'clock. It's the 6th year for the downtown Christmas parade.
Okay, great. Richard.
And Errol, you touched on it a little bit earlier, too. I think we'll start hearing more discussion in the next few weeks on the 4 Civil War monuments, with the move this week to declare them nuisances with the council. We should start to see where that goes.
All righty. Thank you guys for being here. I want to thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good day.